All right, Jeff, it's Women's History Month. We got somebody who's a bit of a historian, storyteller for women in her own right here. Award winning writer and author Kate Fagan joins the show. Kate, thank you so much for the time.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
All right.
So, Kate, before we get to your new book, You Hoop Muses, we would be remiss if we didn't mention as a Philadelphia show your time as the beat writer of the Sixers for the Philadelphia Inquirer.
I love Philadelphia. Like, it's just every time I'm back there, I talk to somebody back there, they remember the days that I was the beat writer. So, I loved it. In fact, in advance of this interview, I texted my best friend is Kate Scott, current voice of the Sixers. So I texted
Right.
her. I was like, "What do I need to know about the team right now? Haven't caught a game in a while." So she sent me like 8 paragraphs. I was like, "Okay, I think I understand. Cool."
So, what do you remember most about your time covering the team?
Oh man, I mean, first is like at the time I didn't think I was that young, right? I was like, oh, I'm kind of seasoned. I'm 27. So now when I look back on it, I'm like, what I kind of think about is I tried really hard. Like I really like worked hard, and I wanted to like convey as much as I could to viewers and fans. But I was really young. I took like kind of risks that I probably wouldn't take now. It was a tough time too. There wasn't a ton of like winning. So it wasn't like the team was happy. They were sort of skeptical of things you did. So it was like it was a huge learning curve for me, and I loved it. But it like, whew, I don't know what I would do if I had to cover the team now. It'd be a completely different thing.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a different feeling around the team and with the team. You know, you go
Yes.
on after you cover the team. You this isn't your first book. We're going to talk about Hoops Muses, but in 2014, you authored your own book, The Reappearing Act, coming out as gay on a college basketball team led by born again Christians. We often talk with athletes about how they use their platform to make an impact for people. For you and the platform that you had and for yourself personally, how important was it for you to tell your own story and help others in the process, probably doing so?
I mean, that book for me, the first book I wrote, it was a different time, even in the sports landscape. I mean, that book was like right around the time when like Jason Collins was on the cover of Sports Illustrated and Michael Sam had just kind of not made the NFL. And women's sports had always kind of operated in a different plane where, there had been more like you would know if you're playing women's sports, like that there were more gay athletes, but still when I was playing college basketball until years after, in all of college basketball, there was no openly gay coach, which is just like absurd. I mean, there's 300 and whatever Division I programs. And so it was still a world where it was hard. So I wrote that book just to for a lot of female athletes who might have, you know, felt similarly, had similar experiences. And even though it wasn't a book that like, was a huge bestseller, there's still like athletes who might email me every once in a while and be like, I read that book in college and it was really helpful. And that's always an awesome feeling.
So, you write that book, and now it's only 9 years later since you wrote that book, right? That book was written
Right.
in 2014. How much has the landscape changed socially between the time you wrote that book and the time that you've now written this book, Hoop Muses?
Oh, I mean, if we're looking at just like the women's sports landscape and then the social issues kind of around it, it's dramatically different. And it almost kind of just reached that tip, I hate that Malcolm Gladwell phrase, but it did. It kind of reached a tipping point where nobody was out and we kind of weren't talking about it. And then in women's sports, just enough women started talking about it that it became almost a non-issue. Like now it almost, it's like when we talk about Sue Bird, we don't really talk about that part of her life. We just talk about the greatness of her game. And so we kind of have gotten almost past that in certain aspects of women's sports, which is not something I would have ever imagined when I was playing or even when I wrote that first book. But yeah, it's drastically different.
So you're out with your new book this week, Hoop Muses. I made sure to say it right this time when I screwed it
It's
up the
tough. I
first
mean, I
time.
can't. You shouldn't feel bad. The percentage of people who have said it right is in the single digits.
This was a concern, though,
Yeah.
for you. I heard you say when this
Yes.
wasn't the original book title. Can you talk about the
No.
process of how this book came about and then how you became comfortable with a title that you weren't into at first?
Yeah. So we kind of went out with it, and we just had a placeholder name of Love and Basketball, because that's if you ask most women's basketball players like what their favorite movie is, it's usually Love and Basketball. It's kind of the only one that got it right, that kind of showed a true love for the game, and as a female athlete you didn't see that represented a lot. But anyway, so we went out with that name, but I knew I couldn't keep that name because everyone would think it was like a companion book to the movie. So but like originally the whole the idea was just born of wanting to do something really fun and joyful in in telling some of these stories that I had known growing up and finding others that I hadn't known, because I didn't think that many people, especially female athletes, are not often allowed to just like be joyful and fun and vibrant. It's often kind of met with you have to account for society's burden on not financially supporting it or whatever. You always had to kind of account for something, and I didn't want that to be the energy of this book. And then the Hoop Muse's name, I've said it enough now that I don't stumble, but as a writer, you pay attention to words. I knew that the two vowels were conflicting, like the hoop and the muse, unless you are doing like linguistic exercises before you say this, you're going to stumble. I almost want like the PR team for the book to send a note. If you're a host, read the book out, the name out loud a couple times. No one thinks to do it. Then they try to say it for the first time, and it hasn't gone well. But I eventually realized most people wouldn't be saying the name of, like, once in the next couple of weeks when I stop talking about it, people will just look at it and you'll read it in your head, and that's much easier to do than to say out loud.
You talk about that you wanted a book that's fun, that talks about women's sports and women's basketball in a different kind of way. The way that the book is written and the way it's presented is even fun. Whose idea was it to come up with the way that, and if you could describe for the listeners, the way that the book is laid out?
So the book is, well, the book is illustrated by Sophia Chang with like really colorful, vibrant illustrations. She does most of the artwork, but then there's like movie posters, reimagined movie posters by Louis Chin. And then there's comic book art throughout by an artist named Milana Bod. And that was a structure I put in place toward the very end of writing the book. The book was basically done, and it was in chronological order. And that just felt like not creative enough for the book we wanted and the illustrations and what we were hoping the experience would be like. And when I had gone out to publishers, we had in the materials that I wrote through, we had this idea that we were going to have this little girl walk across the bottom of every page. Like, so, those books where you can like flip through the pages and it gives you like movement.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted to have like a young girl. She'd be really young in the beginning pages and she'd get older as you went through the book. But when we got to the end, Sophia had already, yeah.
It's not in my copy.
Well, no, yeah. It's not there. It's not there. And because Sophia had done so many illustrations, I didn't want to make her do 230 little girl illustrations. So I went out and found a comic book artist, and I was like, you know what, we're gonna start in the future, and we're gonna create this like device where this future athlete, kind of almost like a Christmas Carol, right, has to like go back in time and like learn. So you start in the future with Jacqueline Jones, who's the biggest star in the future, but she doesn't know who Maya Moore is, so it's like, oh, you don't know who Maya Moore is? Like, oh, young one, we're gonna have to take you on a journey. And you kind of learn, and in the comic books are throughout, and you learn and you kind of go along with her, and she's reacting to things she'd never known. And then we bring her back to the future in 2072, and she's, edified. She has learned the history and she understands the lineage of her game.
Talk to us about how important this book is for marking those cultural references for women in sports, so that they can be included in these larger conversations and let girls connect with women athletes more, so they don't have to have posters of men athletes that they look up to on the wall. They can have the Maya Moores up on the wall like you talk about.
Yeah, I think, that was top of mind for me when we were making this book was just, we talked about, and we hope at some point, kind of in the next month or two, we might create posters of some of Sophia's illustrations of certain players who are front and center, like, like Kelsey Plum right now, who plays for the Aces, is a really dynamic player, really popular player. And we just wanted some of like the amount of resources we poured into this book is sort of standard fare for what happens in the men's game. You got beautiful artwork and beautiful posters you can find, whether it's Nike ads, Adidas ads, Puma ads, and you could have those posters growing up. And those just really were incredibly rare to find. And it's not that I don't think you're ever going to get away from certain, players loving whoever NBA stars are of that day, because that's what the culture loves. But I think it's okay if they have both a Steph Curry poster, and a Sabrina Ionescu poster. And just to get to some of that parity or make those things more easily accessible is certainly part of the future I want. And just being able to inject some of that like dynamic pop culture into the book was key from the start.
Yeah, I mean, this might be a bad analogy, so you both can shoot me down if you want to. But I think about like boys grew up with Space Jam, and
Yep.
this book has almost like a literary version of Space Jam to it, and I could picture girls and hopefully boys too wanting some of the art that is in here there on their wall and kind of looking at it and saying, "I'd love to be in that kind of photo and be Maya Moore or one of the other people that are in the book."
Yeah, no, I mean that is definitely kind of the analogy is just it's sometimes we forget the amount of, like, you take Space Jam, for example. I don't know what the budget was of that movie, but like probably pretty expensive, right? Like let's
Mm-hmm.
say it was Space Jam 2. Let's say it was 100 million. Think about like the amount of money that is poured into creating some beautiful, like kind of graphical artwork and a moving motion picture. At the heart of it is selling to people LeBron James, Michael Jordan, the NBA, and the men's game. And that's not money that's coming out of the NBA's pocket. And so some of that is like part of what we wanted to infuse into this book was like, the ways that we have taken the men's game and other parts of pop culture have poured their resources into elevating it, whether it's sneaker culture, fashion, movies, music. All of that stuff does so much legwork for the NBA or men's sports. And, in our own little way, because we have like at the back of it, we have like the original Space Jam poster, but this one stars Cheryl Swoops. And then we have like the Space Jam 2, but this one stars Asia Wilson. Just to show you like what kind of cool cultural touchstones would exist if women had been at the center of them.
You talk in the book about the significance when Barack Obama came to a game, and we're talking about pop culture and celebrity sort of embracing the game and elevating the level. What has to happen to have pop culture and celebrities embrace the game even more, and frankly, have the league embrace them more to those celebrities that want to reach out? So that you get that energy, like when you have a Spike Lee sitting courtside for the Knicks or Jack Nicholson sitting there for the Lakers, you have that celebrity associated with that team that gets more media coverage that doesn't change the fact they're great ball players, but gives them more exposure just by somebody associating with the sport.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good point about the way that like those courtside seats kind of create this energy that sells an extra 10,000 tickets. Like I would go to a Brooklyn Nets game because I'm like, well, if Jay-Z's going to be there, that means I'm in the cool spot, So I'm willing to pay, $80 for a ticket in a certain section because I'm clearly part of something cultural here. And I think the WNBA is slowly getting there. I mean, this last year, I could name more instances of that than I necessarily could have in the past. Like I'm thinking now of like Chance the Rapper being at almost all of the Chicago Sky games when they won the title, not this past season, but the season before. And then also just the men of the NBA, the male players in the NBA, like on the heels of the death of Kobe, kind of taking up that mantle and really advocating for the women's game and sharing the spotlight by not just kind of like begrudgingly going to one game a year, but like genuinely being fans and engaging with the storylines around the W. Like, I don't think we've ever seen one of the best players in the NBA kind of get into the free agency of the WNBA before Kevin Durant started talking about getting Breanna Stewart to get, to come to New York from Seattle. It's stuff like that really drives the cultural value of things. But I don't know how you take the next step. Sometimes I think it's just planting the seed in people's minds. Like I forget who it was who mentioned like the WNBA will have made it when like Beyonce sits courtside. But like if Beyonce knew that all she had to do was go to one Liberty game to like change how people feel about the Liberty, she'd probably go to a Liberty game. She probably just hasn't even considered that, she's very busy, so maybe she wouldn't. But it probably hasn't crossed her mind the amount of value that would provide to the league. But I think those things are on the horizon.
Well, speaking of like what could make the game better? What about the idea of NIL? How important is NIL to all women's sports, but particularly women's basketball?
I mean, we've been talking about, like, I do a podcast called Off the Looking Glass, and we have a lot of college coaches on, from Dawn Staley to Kelly Jolly Harper at Tennessee, and we asked them about the NIL or players themselves. Aaliyah Boston we had on, and like, I wish I could fully understand what is happening with the NIL. Like I try to understand the collectives, and I also try to understand the impact for the future of women's sports, because the NIL is not driven by NIL money for female athletes. Obviously, it's driven by where football players and men's basketball players are going. So I'm at a little bit of a loss right now to figure out what the future there is and what that relationship's going to be like. I think in the short term, it's going to reinforce right now that the way the WNBA is in terms of just a hard salary cap on the way they pay players, as well as like they still don't have charter flights. Like we still have a few years before that next collective bargaining agreement. So it still reinforces that the NCAA right now is a really strong place to play if you're a female athlete, because if you're a Caitlin Clark at Iowa, you're going to get NIL money. You're playing in front of like sold out crowds. There's not much right now that the WNBA is going to offer you besides the absolute best competition. So you have to decide whether you're going to kind of stay and make some money and play in front of a home crowd, or whether you're ready to test yourself against the very best. But that doesn't quite answer your question, because I'm a bit at a loss for like what the actual future of the NIL will look like.
Don't worry, so is everybody else. Doesn't matter.
Okay, good. I mean, I wasn't if you wanted me to provide clarity,
no,
I completely failed.
It honestly doesn't matter whether you ask coaches, commentators. Nobody seems to know what
athletic directors. Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Right.
Nobody knows what that world will end up looking like. I did want to ask. We talked more about the culture side of the book, the history side of the book. I introduced you as a historian. I learned a lot about the women's game reading this book, from the 2-1 game where men were banned from watching but climbed up to the rooftops to look through, to dispelling myths that I thought where New York is the last state in the country to have a high school women's basketball tournament, that women's basketball actually became more prominent in the South and in small rural towns. Can you talk about how this game has grown through time and how you were able to tell that historical story?
Well, I've never been called a historian before, and I really kind of it agreed with me, because I was talking to Howard Bryant, who I work with at Meadowlark, and he is definitely more of a historian. He's written books on the history of baseball, and I was like, there's nothing better than learning some nugget in history that is so cool, and then you can also apply it to like why the world is the way it is today. And so I really embraced that in reporting this book. And I didn't know, I thought I knew a lot about basketball history going into this project, but I really couldn't tell you much between 1891 and 1970. But the process of like finding out about the games, like you mentioned the first intercollegiate game between Stanford and Cal, which like sounds like it should be boring, but the way that you really learn about like the ways culture limited women in those early days, like there were 9 people per side. in that game. Women were trapped in thirds of the court with no dribbling. So it's like when it ended 2-1, you have to ask yourself, how would you score if you could only stay in the third of a court? You couldn't dribble. So it's like you can't move, So it's like if you catch the ball and there's a defender there, like what are you really going to do? You can't.
I guess there's no traveling.
There's no traveling,
right.
but you can't run with the ball. You have to. So it's just very complicated. But all of this was in an attempt to, try to keep the game as long as they could. And by that I mean they knew they couldn't make it too physical. They had to change the rules because they knew they would be canceled if they played it the way the men played it. They just wanted the game to stay. It still got canceled anyway, right? Like Stanford cancels it a couple years later, and you don't see women's basketball at Stanford again until 60s and 70s, and now they are the behemoth they are today. But I mean, they're just like, there were so many stories throughout the history that really showed like Depression era cities and barnstorming clubs, and just really reflected the culture in the same way we just have come to expect men's sports do.
What's been the reception among the women's basketball community to the book?
Well, I think we're kind of in the early stages where, everyone kind of has their book. They're kind of looking at it. So right now it's just like kind of that superficial, like, this is beautiful. Like, we love it. I'm interested when then, you get into it and like, who did I forget? Who did I leave out? Like,
that's for the next book.
Yeah, exactly. Like, whose power meter did I get incorrect on the NBA Jam reimagining? We'll see how all that plays out in the long run.
You didn't shy away from the tough issues in this book. You took on the issue of WNBA players earning huge salaries overseas, wrongful detention of Brittany Griner. We talked with TJ Quinn recently about how delicate it was for him to report on that issue. From your perspective, how do you think that issue played out, and what has to change for women to stop going overseas for those dollars to stay and play here?
Yeah. I mean, women playing in Russia and China was just sort of a fact of life for me for 10, 15 years, especially when I was at ESPN. Like I went to China to write a story about Brittany. I went to Russia 3 times. So it was surprising when you're kind of shocked out of your bubble and you hear that people are coming to learn for the first time that women have to go overseas to make money. But I think that the key thing that I think about right now that Brittany Griner is home, is that the future of the W right now is there's a couple things that are on the horizon. And the first is that the league's TV rights are up in 2 years. And I think this is like, couldn't be better timing for them to be up. I mean, they've been at ESPN for so long, and they've often just been a toss in with the NBA rights. And this is going to be the first time they've really hit the open market in a moment when a lot of streamers want to get into TV rights, and the WNBA could be like an affordable first step into that. And I think the WNBA is also in a position to say, like, it can't just be our league rights. You also have to build storytelling around the games, because that has been a huge downfall of like having those league rights at ESPN. Like, there hasn't been really any talk shows, any post game shows, like to like actually introduce people to who these athletes are. And I say all that in conjunction with like, how can this change players going overseas? Like, huge TV rights deal, which brings you to the next CBA, which brings you to higher salaries, which brings you down the road to where players don't need to go overseas, which possibly brings us to something like and this is just my own pet, project, is like, if women's basketball had something like a Champions League, that could be amazing, because it can't really happen now because the best teams have the same players, right? So it'd be like the Seattle Storm against UMMC Katerinburg, and it's like, well, Sue Bird plays for both. Like, who would she play for in the Champions League? But if you get the WNBA to be like its own league, you could start to like really grow the game in terms of the storytelling internationally too.
All right. Well, before we let you go, you come from a school that is a top 20 basketball school right now.
Right.
Predictions for the upcoming NCAA tournament, women's?
Yeah, I mean, so I think what is the betting line is like South Carolina, like, if you bet $100, you can only win 107 or something if they win the tournament. But I wouldn't take that bet just because I like a value bet. So I'd probably go more with like Stanford, maybe a Stanford. I might even, because it's crazy, the odds on UConn, I might put some money on a UConn. I would love to see Indiana or Iowa in the Final Four. So, I believe South Carolina is going to win, but I don't want to just put my money there. It's just not fun enough. Colorado's odds are, if I put $100 on Colorado and they won, I'd get $24,000 back. So,
and you'd be very happy.
Yes, I would.
Well,
but one other question though, you mentioned South Carolina. How important are women's coaches like Dawn Staley and Becky Hammond to the sport and growing the sport?
Oh, because so much of the focus of women's basketball has been at the college level, and that's where you have the infrastructure that makes the most sense to grow it, right? That you have like alumni, there's a baked in reason to have connection. A school can be 150 years old, even if its basketball program isn't. So the college game is where the game has really grown, and having coaches that are dynamic and they stay at places gives you that long storytelling that is hard to get when you don't have the history of, let's say, the NBA on the WNBA side, although it's growing. So when you've got, and it's great that Dawn is dynamic, that she's willing to say things. Same with Gino. Like over the years, he's basically said whatever he wanted at every turn. So whenever coaches stay in places and they're willing to play the villain or be willing to speak their mind, it does wonders for just everyday casual sports fans' ability to like quickly connect to the storyline and have a reason to turn on a game.
The book again is Hoop Muses, an insider's guide to pop culture and the women's game. You should get it. It's worth your time. Kate, thanks so much for the time and best of luck with the book.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, guys.